Hi everyone, it's Connor again. So welcome to the first official video of really starting to get into jazz improvisation. I think it's a logical first step to take for us to really talk about harmonically where certain things are coming from in music. In other words, the more we really know about basic things, the more it's going to help us in the long run. So I'm going to start with a story that some of you might be familiar with, and it's a creation story. So there was a poet a long time ago named James Weldon Johnson, and he wrote a poem called The Creation, which was about the creation story that's depicted in the Old Testament of the Bible. And so some of you may know this, but in the beginning God created the earth and the trees and the rocks and, all the plants and animals and all that stuff. He created the world and everything in it, right? So if we think of that in musical terms, our musical world is the chromatic scale. In other words, if we look at a piano here, if I go from middle C up to B natural, and I play everything in between, that's our chromatic scale. We've got all 12 notes that we're dealing with in a chromatic scale, right? So in musical terms, we can think of the chromatic scale as our musical world, okay? Now, moving on from there, if we follow the rest of the story, after God created the world and everything in it, He created man and woman. So if we think of that in musical terms, if we start with a chromatic scale that has 12 notes, and we want to create a man and woman of our musical world, if we have 12 notes and we divide that by 2, we get 2 sixes. And the 2 sixes that we're dealing with are the 2 whole tone scales. That's the C whole tone scale, and that's the C sharp whole tone scale. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what a whole tone scale may be, it's really, really simple. If we think of intervals for a second, a minor second, which some people also know as a half step, looks like that, and then a whole step is a distance of 2 half steps. Now, in order to create a whole tone scale, we just use a series of whole steps to construct it. So the C whole tone scale is made entirely of whole steps. Likewise, the C sharp whole tone scale is made entirely of whole steps. So going back to the chromatic scale, we've got 12 notes, and if we divide that by 2, we get the 2 whole tone scales, which each have 6 notes within them. And also, so 6 plus 6 equals the full 12. There you go. So now our musical world is starting to get more interesting, right? We start to add all these smaller things. Now, man and woman, once they're created, we know what they do. They end up having children. So for the sake of our further musical discovery, let's say that the 2 whole tone scales get together and they have 3 children. Those 3 children are what are known as fully diminished 7th chords. And those 3 fully diminished 7th chords are as follows. The C fully diminished 7th chord, the C sharp fully diminished 7th chord, and D fully diminished 7th chord. So if we look at the construction of a fully diminished 7th chord, if we go back to half steps and whole steps, the distance between every one of the 4 notes is equal, it's symmetrical, okay? And the distance is 3 half steps. So if I'm trying to play a C fully diminished 7, I just go up 3 half steps. 1, 2, 3, then another 3 half steps. 1, 2, 3, then another 3 half steps. 1, 2, 3. And that's your fully diminished 7th chord. Now, in order to further prove that these 3 fully diminished 7th chords come from the 2 whole tone scales, you'd need look no further than the basic construction of them. Take a look at this. If I play a fully diminished 7th chord, you'll notice something interesting. These 2 notes, the C and F sharp, come from the C whole tone scale. Right? So I'll say that one more time. These 2 notes come from the C whole tone scale. And the other 2 notes, the E flat and the A natural, come from the C sharp whole tone scale. So it's completely obvious where we get those fully diminished 7th chords from. We get them from the 2 whole tone scales. And you can do that with the other 2 ones as well. So that's really important to realize. So we go from our chromatic scale to our 2 whole tone scales, and then we get our 3 fully diminished 7th chords. Okay? Now we can go even further from there, and this is as far as I'm going to go for this particular video. The fully diminished 7th chords, we get a multitude of different chords from. And the most important chord we get from a fully diminished 7th chord is a dominant 7th chord. Okay? I'll say that one more time. The most important chord quality that we get from a fully diminished 7th chord is a dominant 7th chord. And I'll explain how that works. If you look at a fully diminished 7th chord, all we have to do is lower any one of the 4 notes a half step, and we'll get a dominant 7th chord. So if I play a C fully diminished 7, and I lower that C a half step to B natural, that's a B dominant 7th chord, right? A major triad with a minor 7. So another way you can think of this is whatever note you lower to, whatever note that is, it becomes the root of your dominant 7th chord. So from C fully diminished 7, if I lower that note a half step, I get B7, right? Let's do a different note. If I lower the E flat a half step to D, that becomes an inversion of D dominant 7. Let's do the next one. If I lower that F sharp a half step to F, then I know I get F7. Okay, let's do the last one. Lowering the A natural to A flat gives me A flat dominant 7. Okay? So the key point I want to get across in this video is that we get 4 dominant 7th chords from every fully diminished 7th chord. We get a family of 4 dominants, and in future videos you'll see why that relationship makes sense. And really it's perfectly logical here, because if we have 3 fully diminished 7th chords, 3 chords, and we have 4 notes that we can lower one note at a time to get the dominance, 3 times 4 equals 12, which is all 12 keys. Right? So just to quickly sum up this video, our musical world starts with the chromatic scale, all 12 notes. And then from there, we get the two whole tone scales, the C whole tone scale and the C sharp whole tone scale. Then from there, we get the three fully diminished seventh chords. And we can prove that because two of the notes in a fully diminished seventh chord come from one whole tone scale, and the other two notes come from the other whole tone scale. That's how you can prove it. It's just logic. And then, if we lower any note, any one of the four notes in a fully diminished seventh chord, one half step, then we get a dominant seventh chord. So that wraps up this video talking about the basics of harmony. We'll get into more chord qualities that we get from the fully diminished seventh chords later, but that's enough for today, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks, guys.